He left me nothing but a broken motorcycle rusting in the corner of the garage, while my brother inherited the entire dealership. Everyone laughed. Nobody noticed the one thing my grandfather always said about that bike. Don't ever sell it. The lawyer's office smelled of old leather and fresh coffee, the kind of room built to make ordinary people feel small. I sat at the far end of the table, the seat nobody fought for, while my brother Marcus leaned back like he already owned the building. Our stepmother, Diane, dabbed at eyes that hadn't produced a single real tear in the 3 years since the funeral. My half-sister Renee scrolled through her phone, bored, waiting for the number that would change her life. The attorney, a thin man named Mr. Holloway, cleared his throat and began reading in that flat, practiced voice lawyers use when they know a room is about to break in half. To my brother Marcus, he read, the entirety of Whitfield Motors, all 7 dealership locations, along with the commercial properties attached to them. Marcus didn't even try to hide his smile. To my stepmother Diane, the family residence on Cedar Lane, along with the investment accounts held jointly with the deceased. Diane exhaled like she'd been holding her breath for a decade. To my sister Renee, the vacation property in Aspen and the remainder of the liquid estate. Renee finally looked up from her phone. And then Mr. Holloway turned a page, adjusted his glasses, and said my name. To my grandson, Daniel, I leave the 1974 motorcycle currently stored in the garage at the Cedar Lane residence, he read, and nothing else. The silence that followed wasn't shock. It was something worse. It was the silence of people trying not to laugh in front of a lawyer. Marcus was the first to break it, a short exhale through his nose that he didn't bother disguising as anything but amusement. Diane reached over and patted my hand with the practiced sympathy of someone who had already stopped caring. Well, she said, at least you'll have something to remember him by. I didn't say anything. I had spent 12 years working in my grandfather's garage on weekends, learning engines from him while Marcus was busy learning golf handicaps and Renee was busy learning which credit cards to max out. Everyone in that room had a story about how close they were to him. I was the only one who had actually spent time with him, and somehow I was the only one who walked away with a machine that hadn't run since before I was born. The meeting ended the way these things always end, with everyone standing too fast, shaking hands they didn't mean, and avoiding my eyes like poverty might be contagious. Marcus clapped me on the shoulder on his way out. Hey, he said, maybe you can sell it for scrap. Get yourself a real vehicle. He laughed at his own joke all the way to the parking lot, where his new company car, technically still my grandfather's asset for another few hours, was waiting. I stayed behind after everyone left, alone in that room with Mr. Holloway, who was gathering his papers with unusual slowness. Before I left, he looked up at me over his glasses and said something that didn't make sense yet. Your grandfather asked me to tell you something, if this is how the reading went. He said, and I'm quoting him directly here, tell Daniel the bike knows more than the rest of them combined. I thought it was a dying man's sentimental nonsense. I would spend the next 3 weeks discovering exactly how wrong I was. The Cedar Lane house didn't feel like home anymore, not with Diane's real estate agent already measuring the driveway for a for sale sign. I drove over on a Tuesday afternoon while she was out, using the garage code my grandfather had given me when I was 16, a code apparently nobody had bothered to change. The motorcycle sat exactly where it had sat for as long as I could remember, draped under a canvas cover gone gray with dust, tucked into the corner behind a wall of unused paint cans and a lawnmower nobody used anymore. I pulled the cover off slowly, the way you'd uncover something that mattered, even if the rest of the world didn't think it did. It was a 1974 model, the kind of machine that had character stamped into every scratch on its tank. The chrome was dulled, the leather seat cracked at the seams, one mirror missing entirely. It looked, by any reasonable measure, like exactly what Marcus had called it. Scrap. But I remembered this bike. I remembered being 9 years old, sitting on the workbench beside it while my grandfather worked, handing him wrenches he didn't actually need just so I'd feel useful. He used to talk to that motorcycle like it understood him, which as a kid I thought was funny, and as an adult I assumed was just the quiet loneliness of an old man who missed being young. He'd run his hand along the tank sometimes and say, this one's got more stories than the rest of the garage combined. I remembered something else too, something I hadn't thought about in 15 years. The last time I saw him work on this specific bike, maybe 6 months before he got sick, he'd been unusually protective about it. He wouldn't let me touch the seat. Told me some parts of a machine you just don't mess with, not because they're fragile, but because they're private. I sat down on the cold garage floor beside the bike and just looked at it for a long time. Whatever it was, whatever he meant when he told the lawyer this bike knows more than the rest of them combined, I had no way of understanding it yet. All I had was an old machine, a strange final message, and a family that had already stopped thinking about either of us. I decided, right there on that floor, that I wasn't going to sell it for scrap. I was going to fix it. If nothing else, I owed him that much. I towed the motorcycle to my apartment complex using a borrowed trailer, ignoring the look my landlord gave me when I asked permission to work on it in the shared lot. I bought a basic toolkit, watched more restoration videos than I'd like to admit, and started the slow process of bringing a 52-year-old machine back to life. The engine was seized, the tires were beyond saving, and the wiring looked like something out of a horror movie. But the deeper I got into the bike, the more I noticed something odd. This wasn't a neglected machine. Someone had maintained it meticulously, right up until the day my grandfather got sick. The oil, though old, had been changed recently by restoration standards. The bolts weren't rusted shut the way you'd expect after years of storage. Someone had prepared this bike to sit exactly as it was, not to decay, but to wait. 3 days into the restoration, I found the first strange thing. Underneath the seat, held by 2 bolts that looked newer than everything else on the frame, was a thin metal plate that didn't match the original manufacturing specs I'd been researching online. It wasn't part of the bike's factory design. Someone had installed it deliberately, and installed it well. I texted my friend Ray, who ran a small mechanic shop 2 towns over and had helped my grandfather source parts back in the day. I sent him a photo. He called me within 10 minutes. "Dan," he said, "where did you get this bike?" I told him it was my grandfather's, that I'd inherited it. There was a pause on the line. "Your grandfather asked me about custom seat modifications about 8 months before he passed," Ray said. I didn't think anything of it at the time. Old guys get sentimental about their bikes. I asked him what kind of modification. He said he didn't know exactly, my grandfather had been vague, but he remembered him asking specifically about compartments that wouldn't show up on a casual inspection. Waterproof. Fireproof if possible. I remember thinking it was a strange request for a man who barely rode anymore, Ray said. Now I'm thinking it wasn't strange at all. I sat in my apartment parking lot that night with a flashlight and a screwdriver, staring at that seat, my heart beating faster than it had any right to over an old piece of leather. Whatever my grandfather had hidden in this bike, he hadn't hidden it carelessly. He'd hidden it like a man protecting something worth protecting. The compartment was harder to open than I expected, sealed with a mechanism disguised as part of the seat's original stitching. It took me almost an hour, working carefully so I wouldn't damage whatever was inside, before the false bottom finally gave way. Inside was a waterproof case, the kind fishermen use to protect documents on a boat. My hands were shaking as I opened it. Inside that case was a stack of papers, yellowed with age but carefully preserved, along with a small leather journal and a single photograph I didn't recognize, a much younger version of my grandfather standing beside a different man in front of a modest storefront, both of them smiling like they'd just won something. I spread the papers out on my kitchen table that night and started reading, and by the second page, my understanding of my entire family's history began to unravel. The documents were patent filings, dated 1968, for a mechanical safety mechanism related to automotive braking systems. The inventor listed was not my grandfather. It was the man in the photograph, a partner named Walter Simmons, who according to the journal had co-founded a small auto parts shop with my grandfather before either of them had any money at all. The journal, written in my grandfather's careful handwriting, told a story I had never heard. He and Walter had developed a braking safety innovation together in their small shop, something Walter had mostly engineered and my grandfather had mostly funded and built by hand. Before they could properly file for full ownership rights together, Walter died suddenly in a car accident, leaving no immediate family except a young daughter who was sent to live with distant relatives out of state. According to the journal, my grandfather never told anyone this daughter existed, And in the confusion and grief following Walter's death, the patent was eventually filed and later expanded upon under the name of the company my grandfather went on to build with a new investor. That investor's name was one I knew instantly. It was Diane's father, my stepmother's father, the man whose capital had originally launched what eventually became Whitfield Motors. I sat back in my chair, the pieces reorganizing themselves in my head. The dealership empire Marcus had just inherited, the properties, the accounts, all of it had grown from a foundation partly built on technology that wasn't fully, legally ours to build on. And somewhere out there, possibly still alive, was Walter Simmons's daughter, a woman who had no idea her father's invention was quietly powering a business empire she'd never once benefited from. I read the rest of the journal that night without sleeping, and what I found wasn't the story of a man who had simply gotten lucky. It was the story of a man who had spent nearly 6 decades carrying a weight he never told anyone about. My grandfather wrote about trying, more than once, to locate Walter's daughter in the years after the business took off. He wrote about hiring someone in the early 80s to search for her, only for the search to go cold when she apparently changed her name after being placed with a new family. He wrote about wanting to make it right, about wanting to give her a share of what her father had truly built, and about the fear that doing so honestly would unravel everything he and his partners, including Diane's father, had built on top of it. There was a particularly hard entry, dated only a few years back, not long before he got sick. He wrote that guilt does not fade with time, it simply gets quieter, and that quiet guilt is still guilt. He wrote that he had decided, finally, that he could not undo the past, but he could make sure the truth did not die with him. He wrote that he trusted me, specifically me, to do the right thing with it if I turned out to be the kind of man who valued truth over convenience. That single sentence hit me harder than anything else in that journal. Out of everyone in our family, he had chosen me to carry this. Not because I was owed anything financially, but because he believed I was the only one who would actually care about doing right by a stranger who'd been erased from her own father's legacy. The photograph made more sense now too. 2 young men standing in front of a modest shop, proud of something they'd built together, with no idea that one of their names would end up etched onto dealership signs across 3 states while the other would quietly disappear from history. I looked at that photograph for a long time, feeling the weight of what I now knew and had no idea what to do with. I thought about Marcus, currently celebrating his new dealership empire. I thought about Diane, already planning to sell the family home. I thought about Renee, probably already spending money from an estate that may have been built on a debt none of them knew existed. And I thought about a woman somewhere out there who had spent her whole life not knowing that a piece of her father's genius was still running through the veins of a company that had never once said her name. I decided that night that I couldn't sit on this information, but I also couldn't walk into my family with wild accusations and no proof. I needed to know 2 things. Whether Walter Simmons's daughter was findable, and whether the patent history actually supported what the journal claimed. I spent the next week after work reaching out to a records researcher I found online, someone who specialized in genealogy and historical business filings. I gave her everything I had, Walter's full name, the original shop's address from the photograph, and the approximate year his daughter would have been placed with relatives. While waiting on her research, I dug into the patent history myself, using public filing databases. What I found matched the journal almost exactly. The original 1968 filing did list Walter Simmons and my grandfather as co-inventors on a preliminary application. But a later filing from 1971, after Walter's death, listed my grandfather as sole inventor, with the application significantly expanded and eventually assigned to a newly formed company backed by Diane's father's capital. That company would go on to become Whitfield Motors' original parts and manufacturing arm before pivoting entirely into dealerships decades later. It wasn't a smoking gun in a courtroom sense. Patents get amended and reassigned for legitimate reasons all the time. But combined with the journal, combined with my grandfather's own written confession of guilt, it painted a picture that was hard to ignore. A man had died, his contribution had been quietly absorbed, and his daughter had been left with nothing while an empire grew on top of the gap he left behind. 2 weeks later, the researcher called me back with a name. Walter's daughter had been renamed after her adoption, and she was, remarkably, still alive, living a modest life 2 states away, working as a schoolteacher, apparently unaware of any connection to a business empire or a father's forgotten invention. Her name was Elaine Marsh. I stared at that name on my screen for a long time, the way you stare at something that's about to change everything, and I realized I was standing at the edge of a decision my grandfather had spent his entire life too afraid to make. I drove 2 states over on a weekend, telling no one in my family where I was going, because at that point I didn't fully trust any of them not to try to bury this before I even had the full picture. I found Elaine Marsh living in a modest house with a well-kept garden, a woman in her early 60s with kind eyes and the tired patience of someone who had spent her career taking care of other people's children. I introduced myself carefully, explaining who I was and who my grandfather had been, watching her face for any flicker of recognition. There was none, not at first. She had no memory of her biological father beyond a single photograph her adoptive family had kept, the same photograph I now had a copy of in my grandfather's case. I told her everything, the shop, the patent, the guilt-ridden journal entries, the empire that had grown from a partnership her father never got to see completed. I watched her go through something I can only describe as controlled devastation, the kind of grief that arrives decades late but somehow doesn't feel any smaller for the delay. She didn't ask about money first, which told me more about her character than anything else could have. She asked about her father. What was he like? What did he sound like? Did he laugh easily? I told her everything my grandfather had written, the pride in those early journal entries, the way he described Walter as the smarter of the two of them, the real engineer behind the idea. Eventually, carefully, I brought up the legal side. I explained that the patent's history suggested her father's contribution had been folded into a company that eventually became worth hundreds of millions of dollars, a company currently owned by my brother, and that I believed, morally if not yet legally, that she was owed something from that. She was quiet for a long moment before she said something I didn't expect. She said she didn't want to destroy anyone's life over something that happened before she could even remember her father's face. She just wanted the truth acknowledged. She wanted her father's name attached to what he built. I told her I intended to make sure of both, the truth and whatever came after it. I just didn't yet know how my own family was going to react when I brought it to them. I decided to start with Diane, not because I trusted her, but because her father's original investment was the direct link between Walter's stolen contribution and the company Marcus now controlled. If anyone in the family had inherited knowledge of how the company was actually built, it would be her. I met her at the Cedar Lane house, now half-packed into moving boxes for the sale she was rushing through. I laid the documents on her kitchen table, the patent filings, the journal excerpts, the photograph. I watched her face carefully as she read, and for the first time since my grandfather's funeral, I saw something other than performed sympathy cross her expression. I saw real fear. She tried, briefly, to deflect. She said her father had built that company through decades of hard work, that whatever happened in 1968 was ancient history, that lawyers from that era did things differently and it wasn't fair to judge it by today's standards. But her voice wavered in a way that told me she already knew this wasn't really about legal standards. It was about a truth she'd probably suspected, quietly, for years. I told her about Elaine. I told her that a woman was alive, was findable, and deserved to know that her father's mind was the actual engine behind a company that had erased his name from its own history. Diane's composure finally cracked. She admitted, quietly, that her father had mentioned Walter once, years ago, in a moment of drunken honesty at a family dinner, something about a partner who died before things really took off. She said she'd never asked more, because some part of her didn't want to know. I told her I wasn't there to destroy the family or the business. I was there because my grandfather had spent his final years drowning in guilt he never resolved, and I wasn't willing to let that same guilt get inherited by silence for another generation. I told her I intended to bring this to Marcus and to make sure Elaine received both acknowledgement and a fair financial resolution, whether the family cooperated or not, because I now had enough documentation to pursue it legally if necessary. Diane didn't agree to anything that day. But she also didn't throw me out of the house, which for her, I realized, was as close to an admission as I was going to get. Marcus was harder, exactly as I expected he would be. I met him at one of his newly inherited dealerships, the biggest one, the flagship location with his name freshly printed on the general manager's office door. He barely looked up from his desk when I walked in, still riding the high of an inheritance that had turned him into a man who owned things. I laid out the same documents, the same story. He listened, or pretended to, scrolling through emails on his phone half the time I was talking. When I finished, he leaned back in his chair with the same dismissive smile he'd worn at the Will reading. "This is what you've been doing with your time," he said. "Chasing conspiracy theories because you're mad you got a broken motorcycle." I told him it wasn't a conspiracy theory, it was documented, it was in grandfather's own handwriting, it was in public patent filings anyone could pull up. He waved it off, said old journals don't hold up in court, said patents get reassigned for 100 boring legal reasons that have nothing to do with theft. He said even if some version of this was technically true, it happened almost 60 years ago, before either of us was born, and dragging a dead man's guilt into the present wasn't going to accomplish anything except making our family look bad publicly. I asked him directly if he even cared whether the foundation of everything he just inherited was built partly on someone else's stolen work. He looked at me for a long moment, and what he said next told me everything I needed to know about how this was going to go. He said, and I remember this exactly, "It doesn't matter how the foundation was built. It matters whose name is on the deed now, and that name is mine." I left that office understanding that Marcus wasn't going to help me do the right thing voluntarily. If Elaine was going to get any real acknowledgement or restitution, it wasn't going to come from family loyalty or guilt. It was going to come from pressure, documentation, and if necessary, exposure. I thought about the motorcycle sitting back in my apartment lot, half restored, and I understood for the first time exactly what my grandfather had meant when he told the lawyer it knew more than the rest of them combined. He hadn't just hidden documents in that seat. He'd hidden a decision, and he trusted me, specifically because I was the one person in this family who might actually make it. If Marcus wasn't going to cooperate, I needed to build something undeniable, strong enough that ignoring it would cost him more than acknowledging it. I hired an intellectual property attorney, a careful, methodical woman named Ms. Ortega, who specialized in historical patent disputes, and I handed her everything: the journal, the original and amended filings, race testimony about the seat modification request, and Elaine's willingness to participate. Ms. Ortega was cautiously optimistic. She explained that while a full legal claim on decades-old reassigned patents would be complex and expensive to pursue in court, the reputational exposure alone would likely be devastating for a modern dealership empire built on family trust and small-town goodwill. Whitfield Motors had spent decades marketing itself as an honest, community-rooted business. A documented story of a co-inventor's daughter being erased from a company built on his mind would not play well in local news, especially with a journal in my grandfather's own handwriting as supporting evidence. She drafted a formal letter, not a lawsuit yet, but a clear notice of the historical claim, along with a proposed resolution, an acknowledgement of Walter Simmons as co-founder of the original technology, and a financial settlement for Elaine reflecting a fair portion of the value that innovation had contributed to the company's growth over the decades. I sent that letter myself, along with copies of the key documents, not just to Marcus, but to the company's board, to Diane, and to the local business journal that had done a glowing feature on Whitfield Motors' 50th anniversary just 2 years earlier. I wasn't trying to burn the family down publicly yet. I was making sure Marcus understood that silence was no longer a safe option. 2 days later, my phone rang. It was Marcus, and for the first time since our grandfather's funeral, he didn't sound confident. He sounded, for the first time in his life, afraid. We met again, this time at a neutral location, a quiet coffee shop instead of his office, which told me more about the shift in power than anything he actually said. Diane was there too, along with Ms. Ortega. Marcus looked like a man who had spent 2 sleepless nights doing math he didn't want to do. He started, predictably, with an attempt to negotiate the story down, offering a small, private settlement to Elaine in exchange for absolute silence, no public acknowledgement, no journal, no name on anything. I told him that wasn't my decision to make, it was Elaine's, and Elaine had already told me clearly that money without acknowledgement meant nothing to her. Diane, surprisingly, was the one who pushed back on Marcus in that meeting, not out of sudden moral clarity, but out of pragmatism. She pointed out that if this became public through the business journal instead of through a controlled, dignified settlement, the damage to the Whitfield name would be far worse than any acknowledgement could cause. Better, she said, to control the story than to be crushed by it. After nearly 2 hours of negotiation, we reached an agreement. Walter Simmons would be formally and publicly recognized as co-inventor of the original safety technology in all company materials and historical documentation going forward. Elaine would receive a significant financial settlement, structured as a permanent royalty tied to the ongoing use of that original technology across all Whitfield locations, not a one-time payout, but an ongoing acknowledgement written into the company's financial structure itself. And a small plaque would be installed at the original dealership location, telling the true story of the two men who had built the company's foundation together. Marcus signed it with the expression of a man who understood he had lost, but had lost as gracefully as his ego would allow. It wasn't the apology I wanted from him. But it was the outcome that mattered, and it hadn't come from him deciding to do the right thing. It had come from a broken motorcycle he'd told me to sell for scrap. I finished restoring the motorcycle 3 weeks later, and I rode it for the first time down the same street where my grandfather used to take me as a kid, the engine finally running clean after 52 years of silence. It felt, in a way I can't fully explain, like closing a loop he'd started decades before I was even born. Elaine came to see the bike a few weeks after the settlement was finalized. She stood beside it in my driveway for a long time, running her hand along the tank the same way my grandfather used to, and she told me something I've thought about often since. She said her father used to tell her, before he died, before she was even old enough to properly remember it, that the things that matter most are rarely the things that look valuable on the surface. Marcus still runs the dealerships, though the plaque now sits at the entrance of the flagship location, and every new employee orientation now includes the true story of the company's founding, whether he likes it or not. Diane sold the Cedar Lane house eventually, but she calls me sometimes now, something she never did before, usually just to ask how the motorcycle's running. I still have the journal. I read it sometimes, especially on nights when I doubt whether doing the right thing was worth the family fractures it caused. And every time, I land in the same place. My grandfather spent nearly 60 years carrying a guilt he never had the courage to resolve while he was alive. He didn't leave me a fortune. He left me a decision, hidden in the one place he knew our family would never think to look. They mocked me for inheriting a broken motorcycle while everyone else walked away with empires. But empires built on silence eventually have to answer for what they buried. All it took was one broken machine, and the courage to actually open it.